The dawn over the Arizona territory was not a thing of color but of texture. It was a fine, silver grit that scoured the horizon, promising a day of heat and wind. The stagecoach, a bone-rattled vessel painted with the faded optimism of the overland mail, bucked and swayed through the last of the red rock canyons before the land flattened into the parched expanse that held the town of Dry Mesa. Inside, Eveline Hart held a leather satchel on her lap, her knuckles white. The satchel contained the sum of her inheritance, a folded sheepskin map, a deed brittle with age, and a photograph of a woman with Eveline's own stubborn chin, her mother. The map was the most precious thing, its spidery ink tracing the veins of an underground spring, a secret line of life promised beneath acres of sun-baked dust. The coach groaned to a sudden, violent stop that sent Eveline lurching against the man opposite her, a drummer in sweat-stained linen. Outside, the driver's curse was cut short by the sharp crack of a rifle. Another followed. The drummer flattened himself to the floorboards. Eveline, after a moment of frozen shock, peered through the dusty window. 3 riders, their faces obscured by dirty bandanas, had the coach penned in. They were not dressed like soldiers or lawmen. They were lean and hard, their movements economical, their rifles held with an easy familiarity. One of them disarmed the driver, while another held a gun on the shotgun guard. The door was yanked open. "Get out," a voice rasped. "Leave your valuables on the seat." The drummer scrambled to obey, his hands trembling. Eveline moved more slowly, her mind racing. The satchel. They would take the satchel. She clutched it tighter. "The bag, lady," the man at the door said, his eyes cold above the cloth. Before she could answer, a sound shifted the air. It was not a gunshot, but a soft thud, like a heavy fruit falling. The man at the door grunted and fell sideways, an arrow protruding from his shoulder. The other 2 bandits spun around, raising their rifles toward the canyon rim. A lone figure stood there against the gray sky, a bow in his hand. He was Dine, his dark hair tied back, his features stark and unreadable from this distance. He moved with a liquid grace, melting behind a rock formation before the bandits could get a clear shot. A rifle shot echoed, the bullet whining off the rock where he had been. Then he was moving again, a shadow flowing over the uneven ground. He was not rushing them. He was simply coming. The 2 remaining bandits exchanged a nervous glance. This was not the kind of fight they had prepared for. This was not a panicked guard or a clumsy passenger. This was something ancient and patient. One of the men made a decision, firing a wild shot toward the rocks before vaulting onto his horse. The other followed suit, leaving their companion groaning on the ground. They spurred their mounts and galloped away, not looking back. Silence descended, broken only by the wind and the whimpering of the wounded man. The driver and guard, stunned but unharmed, retrieved their weapons. The figure from the rocks walked down into the road. Up close, he was a man of about 30, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes were not calm at all. They were dark and intelligent, and they missed nothing. They swept over the scene, the coach, the passengers, the fleeing riders, and the man on the ground. He knelt beside the wounded bandit, pulled the arrow from his shoulder with a clean, efficient motion, and pressed a wad of cloth against the wound. He spoke a few words in a language Eveline did not understand, his voice low and firm. The bandit, pale with pain, only nodded. The dying man stood, and his gaze fell on Eveline. She was still standing by the coach door, her satchel pressed to her chest. His eyes lingered on it for a moment, then met hers. There was no warmth in them, but no malice either. There was only an unnerving stillness, a deep and quiet knowing. He gave a curt nod to the driver and then, without another word, walked to his own horse tethered out of sight and rode away in the opposite direction of the bandits, vanishing as silently as he had appeared. Dry Mesa was less a town than an argument with the desert. A single dusty street was flanked by a dozen sun-bleached buildings, a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a church whose bell tower seemed to lean in perpetual prayer for rain, and Josie Pike's boarding house. The air smelled of hot dust, horse manure, and the faint, greasy scent of beef tallow from the smithy. The center of town life, and the source of its power, was the public well, its stone housing scarred by 1,000 rope burns. Josie Pike was a woman built like the land itself, wide and unyielding, with a face mapped by sun and skepticism. She looked Eveline up and down as she signed the register. "Hart, you say just passing through?" "No," Eveline said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands from the morning's ordeal. "I am here to stay. My mother left me a parcel of land just east of here." Josie grunted. "Land is plentiful. Water is not. A glass of water will cost you a penny. A bath will cost you $1, and my eternal suspicion." Eveline managed a small smile. "I was told the price of a life in Dry Mesa is a glass of water." Josie's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You were told right. That man who helped you out on the trail. The Navajo, Cainez, he knows the value of things. Does not say much, but he sees everything. Stays out of trouble, mostly, but trouble seems to find him." Later that afternoon, as Eveline sat in the small dining room trying to eat a plate of beans and tough bread, the door swung open and 2 men entered. One was large and florid, his expensive coat stretched tight over a prosperous belly. His name, she would soon learn, was Silas Grigg, and he owned the largest cattle ranch in the county. The other man was the town marshal, Devereaux. He was younger, handsome in a severe way, with eyes the color of a winter sky. The room fell quiet. Men who had been talking loudly over their meals suddenly found their plates fascinating. Grigg's gaze swept the room, and it was the look of a man counting his possessions. It settled on Eveline. She had her satchel on the chair beside her and had, foolishly, taken out the map for just a moment to get her bearings. She folded it quickly, but not before Grigg's sharp eyes had registered the old parchment and the ink lines. He did not say anything to her directly, but leaned toward the marshal and murmured something. Devereaux nodded slowly, his own cold gaze fixing on her. They took a table across the room. Eveline felt their eyes on her as she finished her meal. The food tasted like ash. She paid Josie and was about to retreat to the safety of her room when Marshal Devereaux rose and approached her table. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a smooth baritone that did not match his eyes. "Marshal Devereaux, welcome to Dry Mesa." "Thank you, Marshal," she said, her posture straight. "I heard about the trouble on the road this morning. We do our best to keep this territory safe, but it is a wide and lawless place, especially for a woman traveling alone." His words were solicitous, but they felt like a cage slowly closing. "I am grateful for the help I received," she said carefully. "Ah, yes. Cainez, he keeps to himself. A former scout for the army, I am told, though he does not talk about it." Devereaux's lip curled slightly, a flicker of distaste. "The law in this town is my responsibility, and that includes ensuring all property claims are properly filed and verified. We have had disputes over land, over water." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I would appreciate it if you would stop by my office in the morning. Bring your deed, and any other pertinent documents you might have. Just a formality, to ensure your protection. Of course." His smile was a thin, bloodless line. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. He wanted to see the map. He wanted the secret her mother had passed down to her. From across the street, sitting in the shade of the livery stable, Cainez watched the marshal speak to the woman from the coach. He had seen the way Silas Grigg had looked at her, the way a hawk looks at a field mouse. He had seen the map. He knew what men like Grigg and Devereaux did for water in a land defined by its absence. He had spent years working for men who wore uniforms and spoke of law, only to see them bend it to their will. He wanted no part of this. He wanted only to be left alone, to live between the world of his people and the world of the white man, belonging to neither. But as he watched Eveline Hart lift her chin in a gesture of defiance that was both brave and foolish, he felt the familiar, unwelcome pull of something he had long tried to bury. A reflex, the instinct to stand between the predator and its prey. He turned away, his jaw tight, and began to check the shoe on his horse. It was not his fight. It was not his trouble. But he knew, with a certainty as deep and unchangeable as the bedrock beneath the dust, that it was about to be. Sleep did not come easily in the narrow room above the street. Eveline lay in the dark, the coarse linen sheet pulled to her chin, and listened to the sounds of dry mesa settling for the night. The boisterous laughter from the saloon faded to a murmur. A dog barked once and then fell silent, and the ever-present wind scraped dust against the window pane. Her meeting with the marshal was a cold knot in her stomach. It was his eyes, the way they had assessed her, not as a person but as a problem, an obstacle to be managed. And the map, the secret of the water. She had pushed it deep into her satchel, but that felt flimsy, vulnerable. Rising from the bed, she moved without a sound, by the thin moonlight filtering through the window. She took the sheepskin map from its leather tube, her fingers, nimble from years of needlework and teaching children their letters, found the loose stitching in the hem of her heaviest traveling skirt. Carefully, she folded the map into a tight, flat square and worked it deep inside the fabric, then smoothed the hem. The deed and the photograph she slipped between the mattress and the bed frame. It was not a perfect hiding place, but it would have to do. She returned to bed, her heart still a frantic drum against her ribs. Hours later, a sound pulled her from a shallow, dreamless sleep. It was a faint scrape of wood on wood from the hallway, followed by the softest pressure against her door. She held her breath, every muscle tensed. The latch clicked, an impossibly loud noise in the profound quiet. The door opened a sliver, then wider, admitting a sliver of a man, a shadow against the lesser dark of the hall. Eveline forced her breathing to remain slow and even. Her eyes slitted just enough to see. The man moved with a practiced silence, crossing the small room to where her satchel lay on a chair. He did not ransack it. His hands were methodical, feeling through the contents, searching for something specific. He felt for the false bottom, checked the lining. A low grunt of frustration escaped him. He moved to the small chest of drawers, opening each one, his hands sifting through her few belongings. Then he knelt by the bed. Eveline felt the slight dip as he ran a hand under the frame, his fingers brushing against the deed. He paused, pulled it out, and in the faint light, unfolded it. Another quiet sound of annoyance. It was not what he was looking for. He slid it back under the mattress and stood. For a terrible moment, his gaze swept over her, and she was certain her racing heart would betray her. But he saw only a sleeping woman. He turned and slipped out of the room as silently as he had entered, the latch clicking softly back into place. Eveline did not move for a long time. She lay rigid, the fear a cold sweat on her skin. When she was sure he was gone, she rose and went to the window. The street below was empty, but from the back of the boarding house, down in the alley that ran behind the livery, a figure emerged from the shadows and walked quickly toward the edge of town. Kai Nez had not been sleeping. He sat with his back against a corral post, watching the stars wheel across the immense, dark sky. It was a habit from his years as a scout, a way of being in the world that felt more natural than sleeping under a roof. He heard the man before he saw him, the crunch of a boot on a loose stone in the alley. It was a careless sound in a night that demanded care. Kai remained perfectly still, a part of the shadows. The man hurried past, keeping his head down. As he passed a scraggly ponderosa pine that grew near the stable, he scraped the sole of his boot against a low-hanging root, trying to rid it of some clinging mud. Kai heard the sticky, tearing sound of it. After the man was gone, his form swallowed by the darkness on the trail leading east toward the Grigg Ranch. Kai rose. He walked to the pine tree. On the ground, near the root, was a small, dark smear. He knelt, touching it lightly. It was not mud. It was pitch, thick and fragrant. He looked at the boot print left in the dust beside it, a worn heel, a distinctive nick in the left side of the sole. He filed the image away in his mind. He did not need to follow the man. The tracks and the destination were already clear. The next morning, Evelyn found her room exactly as the intruder had left it, subtly disturbed. She dressed, retrieved her papers, and went downstairs. When Josie Pike set a plate of fried cornmeal mush in front of her, she looked at the older woman's shrewd eyes. "I had a visitor last night," Evelyn said, her voice low. "Someone came into my room while I was sleeping." Josie's face did not register surprise, only a grim tightening of her lips. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Did they take anything?" she asked. "No, they were looking for something they did not find." Josie nodded slowly. "Go see Dr. Whitcomb. His office is next to the assayer's. Tell him Josie sent you. He has been here a long time. He has seen a lot." The doctor was a man who seemed to be held together by sinew and memory. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes were clear and kind. He listened patiently as Evelyn recounted the events of the last day. The ambush, the marshal's summons, the intruder in the night. He sighed, leaning back in his chair, which creaked in protest. "Silas Grigg," he said, his voice raspy with age. "He has a thirst that this whole territory could not quench. Not for whiskey, but for land, and the water that makes it worth a damn." "He warned me about disputes," Evelyn said. "The marshal." Dr. Whitcomb gave a short, bitter laugh. "Devereaux is Grigg's loyal hound. He fetches whatever his master points at. A few years back, a family settled north of here. Good people. The father, a fella named Miller, was a dowser. Found a little spring on his property, just enough for his family and a decent garden. Grigg offered to buy him out. Miller refused. A month later, the Millers were gone. Their cabin was empty, the door swinging in the wind. Devereaux said they must have packed up and left for California, but people do not just leave a working spring. Not in this country. The unspoken words chilled Evelyn more than the night's intrusion. "Be careful, young woman," the doctor finished, his kind eyes now filled with sorrow. "The law here is a fence built to keep Grigg's cattle in, not to keep the wolves out." Evelyn left the doctor's office with a cold resolve settling over her fear. The intruder had not been a common thief. He had been sent. Marshal Devereaux's request to see her papers was not about protection. It was about acquisition. If she went to his office, he would find a reason, any reason, to invalidate her claim. He would tie her up in legal knots until she either gave up or, like the Millers, disappeared. Her mother had not endured an ocean crossing and a life of hardship for her daughter to surrender her only legacy to a bully and his uniformed dog. She would not run. She would fight, and to fight, she needed to know her own ground. She needed to see the spring for herself, to mark its location, to confirm what the map promised. She found Kai Nez in the livery stable, mending a bridle. He worked with a quiet focus, his hands strong and sure. He looked up as she approached, his face impassive, but she saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I need to hire a guide," she said without preamble. He continued his work, threading a leather lace through a buckle. "The land is not forgiving," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I am not asking for forgiveness. I want to go to my property, east of here. I need to survey it. I will pay you." He set the bridle down and finally looked at her fully. His gaze was intense, searching. "Trouble found you on the road yesterday," he said. "It found you again last night. If you go out there, it will follow you." "I am aware. That is why I need someone who knows the land better than they do." "Why?" he asked. "Why not just leave go somewhere with more water and less trouble?" "It is my mother's land," she said simply. "It is all I have of her. It is mine." He was silent for a long moment. Studying her face, he saw the fear she was trying to hide. But he saw something else, too, a bedrock of resolve as unyielding as the red stone of the canyons. It was a foolishness he recognized, a stubborn refusal to be erased. He had seen Grigg's men before. He knew their brand of casual cruelty. He knew what they did to those who stood in their way, especially those the law would not protect. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "I will take you," he said. "Be ready at first light. Bring water, and ask no questions." Relief washed over Eveline, so potent it almost made her knees buckle. "Thank you," she said. He simply picked up the bridle and went back to his work. The conversation, for him, already over. That evening, Evelyn spoke quietly with Josie in the kitchen while the other boarders ate in the dining room. She told her she would be gone for a few days, heading out to her property with Kai Nez. Josie listened, her face grim, and packed a sack with dried jerky, hard biscuits, and a small canteen she insisted Evelyn take. "There is a man who eats here sometimes," Josie said, her voice barely a whisper. "A salesman. He listens more than he talks. Be careful who you trust." Across town, Marshal Devereaux stood in the dusty confines of his office. A man stood before his desk, twisting a sweat-stained hat in his hands. It was the drummer from the stagecoach. "She is a stubborn one," the drummer said, avoiding the marshal's eye. "Hired that Indian Nez to take her out to her claim tomorrow. Heard her telling the pike woman myself." Devereaux smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. "Did she now?" he murmured. "Well, we cannot have a lady getting lost out there, can we? It is my duty to look after her." He dismissed the man with a wave of his hand and walked to the window. Looking out at the fading light, he watched the last of the sun paint the distant mesas in shades of blood and rust. He now knew where she was going. The map was as good as his. They left before the first hint of gray touched the sky, moving out of the sleeping town like two ghosts. The desert was cool and smelled of dust and creosote bush. Kai rode a sturdy buckskin horse, and he had procured a gentle mare for Eveline. He led the way, not along the main trail, but through a series of arroyos and washes that seemed to have no logic, yet he moved with an unhesitating sense of direction. He did not speak, and Eveline, sensing the need for silence, did not try to fill it. She watched him, the way he sat his horse, a seamless extension of the animal, his eyes constantly scanning, reading a language she could not comprehend. After an hour, he stopped, holding up a hand. He dismounted and pointed to the ground. "See," he said, his voice quiet, as if not to disturb the air. Eveline looked down and saw only scuffed dirt. He crouched, tracing a faint line with his finger. "Coyote. The drag of the back paw means he is old. And here, the snake's path is straight, not curved." He was moving fast, hunting, but the wind is coming from the west. He will hunt east this morning. He taught her, not with lectures, but with observations. He showed her how the leaves of a certain plant curled to conserve moisture, a sign of a long, dry day ahead. He pointed out the distant haze that was not haze at all, but dust kicked up by a herd of cattle miles away. He made her sip from her canteen sparingly, a small mouthful to wet the tongue, never a deep swallow. He taught her to walk beside her horse on steep inclines to spare the animal's strength. It was a lesson in economy, in existing within the landscape rather than fighting it. Every movement had a purpose, every observation a meaning. In the heat of midday, they rested in the shade of a rock overhang. It was Eveline's turn. She unrolled her mother's map, spreading it on a flat stone. It was more than a simple drawing of property lines. Her mother, a woman with a surprising passion for geology, had made notes in the margins, sketching the formations of rock, the tilt of the strata. "This line here," Eveline explained, pointing with a twig, "represents a layer of shale. It is impermeable. Water cannot pass through it. But this layer above, this is sandstone. It is porous. When rain falls up in the high country, it soaks into the sandstone and travels underground until it hits the shale. It has nowhere to go but sideways." She traced the path of the theoretical water. If the angle of the layers is right, and there is a fault, A crack in the rock that reaches the surface, the water will seep out. Kai listened, his usual impassivity replaced by a focused curiosity. He understood the land's surface, its animals and plants. She was showing him its bones, its hidden veins. He looked from the map to the surrounding hills, seeing them now not just as shapes against the sky, but as a collection of layers, a story of pressure and time. He had always known where to find water by looking for cottonwoods or willows. But she was explaining the deeper grammar of the earth. The knowledge flowed between them, a quiet current of respect. She had her survival skills, and he had his. They were different, but equally vital. Late in the afternoon, a faint sound carried on the wind, a distressed cry that was not animal. Kai reined in his horse instantly, his head cocked. He slid from the saddle and motioned for her to do the same. He moved forward on foot, silent as a flowing shadow, weaving through the scrub and rocks. Eveline followed, her heart pounding. They found him in a shallow ravine, a dine boy, no more than 13, his leg caught in the rusty jaws of a coyote trap. The chain was staked to the ground. The boy, whose name they would learn was Little Bear Bigay, was pale with pain and exhaustion, his dark eyes wide with fear. Kai spoke to him in their shared language, his voice calm and reassuring. The boy answered in a weak whisper. Kai examined the trap. It was crudely made, powerful but lacking the precision of a professional trapper's tool. It was the kind of thing a ranch hand might nail together, meant to maim rather than just capture. He looked at the ground around it, his eyes missing nothing. There were tracks of 2 shod horses. They had not been here to trap coyotes. The trap had been placed on a faint game trail, a place where a person on foot might walk. This was Grig's work, he said to Eveline, his voice a low, hard growl, careless, cruel. They worked together. He showed her how to use a stout branch as a lever, placing it between the jaws of the trap. It took all of her strength to press down while he worked with his knife to free the boy's mangled leg. Little Bear cried out once, a sharp gasp of pain, but did not make another sound. Kai cleaned the wound as best he could with water from his canteen and bound it with a strip of cloth from his own shirt. He then lifted the boy as if he weighed nothing and carried him to a sheltered spot. He is from a family that camps near here, Kai explained. He was checking his rabbit snares. He gave the boy a little water and some of the jerky Josie had packed. The boy's fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet, worshipful gaze fixed on Kai. The incident changed the tenor of their journey. The threat was no longer theoretical. Kai's vigilance sharpened. He was no longer just a guide. He was a protector. The old instincts, the ones honed scouting for the army, resurfaced. He felt the familiar, bitter taste of it. The skills he had learned in service to men he did not trust were now being used to protect this woman and this boy from the same breed of careless greed. As dusk approached, they found the landmark described in the official deed from the Dry Mesa town office, a tall, solitary spire of rock that looked like a stone finger pointing at the sky. This was their starting point. Eveline took out her compass and a copy of the survey notes. According to this, the southern boundary marker should be 400 paces due east from this spire, she said. She began to walk, counting her steps carefully. Kai and Little Bear, who insisted he could walk with the help of a branch, followed. She stopped at 400 paces. There was nothing. Are you sure? Kai asked. I am positive. I have a naturally consistent stride. They searched the area. Finally, behind a thick clump of sagebrush, they found it a pile of rocks, stacked in the manner of a survey marker. But it felt wrong. The stones were too clean, the moss on them disturbed. It looked new. Eveline consulted her mother's map again, her brow furrowed in concentration. My mother's notes say the marker is not east. It is east by southeast, and it is not 400 paces. It is 480. Her map was drawn from a much older survey, the original territorial claim. They set off again, this time on the bearing from her mother's map. At roughly 480 paces, in a small wash almost completely obscured by overgrown mesquite. They found it. It was a single, large, flat stone, half buried in the sand, with a cross chiseled deep into its surface. It was weathered and ancient, settled into the earth as if it had been there for a generation. This was the true corner of her property. The other marker, the one that matched the official record in town, was a fabrication. Someone moved the boundary, she whispered, a cold dread seeping into her. They moved it almost 100 yards north. Kai knelt, studying the ground. He looked back toward the false marker, then toward the hidden alcoves and cliffs that now fell within the true boundary. Someone with authority. He said, someone who could change the papers in the town office to match a new marker. Devereaux, she said, the name leaving a bitter taste. He did this to cut a piece of my land off. But why? Kai did not answer. He just looked toward the cliffs. Let's find out. They followed the true property line, which led them into a narrow box canyon Eveline's official deed had excluded. The walls rose high on either side, the red sandstone glowing in the last of the sun's light. And there, tucked into a deep alcove, hidden from any casual view, was a dark stain on the rock face, a vertical streak of dampness, glistening in the fading light. At the base of the rock, a small pool of water, no bigger than a dinner plate, had collected. A cluster of impossibly green ferns grew in the damp earth around it. It was not a torrent, not a gushing spring. It was a slow, patient, life-giving seep, a miracle in a land of dust. This is it, Eveline breathed, her voice filled with awe. She knelt and touched a finger to the water, then to her lips. It was cool and sweet. It was real. They made a cold camp that night, not daring to risk a fire. Little Bear was sleeping soundly, exhausted from his ordeal. The stars emerged, a brilliant, dense scatter of diamonds against black velvet. He did not just move the line, Kai said, breaking the long silence. He stole your water. I know. Eveline sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, looking at the dark entrance to the canyon where her future lay hidden. They will not stop. Now that I know, they will be more determined than ever. You should leave, Kai said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, she looked at him, her eyes clear and resolute in the starlight. My mother gave me this. It is a legacy of hope, not a deed to a patch of dust. I will not let them steal it. He studied her, the stubborn set of her jaw, the fierce light in her eyes. He had seen that look before, in soldiers defending a hopeless position, in his own people refusing to be broken. He had tried to walk away from such fights, but one was here, now, sitting beside him, and he knew, with a weary resignation, that he was no longer just a guide for hire. Her fight for a trickle of water seeping from a rock had somehow become his own. They returned to dry mesa under the harsh glare of a midday sun that bleached all color from the landscape. Their first stop was not the town proper, but the cluster of hogans and brush arbors that constituted the small dine encampment on the far side of the creek bed. They delivered Little Bear Begay to his grateful family. The boy's father, a man with a quiet dignity etched into his face, looked at Kai and spoke a few soft words. He then turned to Eveline and gave a slow, solemn nod. No payment was offered. None was expected. It was a matter of community, an obligation of kinship that Eveline was beginning to understand operated on a plane entirely separate from the world of coin and commerce in the town. When they rode into the main street, it felt as though every window held a pair of watching eyes. News, in a place this small and thirsty, traveled faster than a horse could run. The sight of Eveline Hart riding back into town alongside Kai Nez was a story in itself. She dismounted in front of the town hall, a plain, box-like structure that seemed to sag under the weight of the sun. Kai swung down from his horse and stood by the hitching post, not speaking, his presence a silent statement. He would wait. Eveline paused, took a deep breath that was mostly dust, and pushed open the door. Marshal Devereaux was seated behind a large pine desk, a stack of papers before him, arranged with meticulous precision. He looked up as she entered, and the smile that touched his lips did not reach his cold eyes. It was a smile of supreme confidence, of a man holding all the high cards. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "I trust you had a pleasant excursion. I was beginning to worry. I have come to file a corrected survey claim and to register a previously unrecorded water source on my property," she said, her voice clear and steady. She would not be baited into discussing her journey. She walked to his desk and laid her documents down, the original deed, her mother's hand-drawn map, and a new survey sketch she and Kai had made, marking the true boundary stones and the location of the spring. Devereaux leaned back in his chair, making a show of examining the papers. He picked up her mother's map, holding it by the edges as if it were a curious but ultimately meaningless artifact. "This is a charming piece of folk art," he said, "but it has no legal standing. The only document this office recognizes is the official survey on file. And according to that survey, which I have right here, your property line ends well short of this canyon you have drawn." "That survey is incorrect," Eveline stated. "The corner marker has been moved. We found the original stone. It is precisely where this older map indicates it should be." He repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Kai Nez was with me. He saw it as well." "Ah," the scout, Devereaux, set her map down with a dismissive pat. "Miss Hart, the law operates on verifiable proof. A woman's claim to her own inheritance is, naturally, biased, and the testimony of a man who is not a citizen, who pays no taxes, who cannot vote or serve on a jury. I'm afraid his word carries no legal weight in a matter of property." He folded his hands on his desk. "What you need is a witness, an impartial, respected, and recognized citizen of this community who can attest to this discovery of yours. Without that, I'm afraid this is all just paper." His gesture dismissed everything she had brought, everything her mother had left her. "I am a citizen," Eveline said, her temper beginning to fray. "Are you saying my word is not good enough?" "I am saying the law has procedures, for everyone's protection." He stood, a clear signal that the meeting was over. "Without a proper witness, there is nothing more to discuss." He held the door for her, his courtesy a more profound insult than any curse. She stood on the wooden sidewalk, the sun blinding after the dim office. The door to the town hall clicked shut behind her, a sound of absolute finality. She saw Kai watching her, his face unreadable, but she could feel his question. "He refused it," she said, the words tasting like defeat. "He says I need a witness, a citizen. He says you do not count." Kai's jaw tightened. The only sign of his reaction, he looked past her, at the facade of the town hall, at the flag hanging limp on its pole. He had heard those words before, in different rooms, from different men in uniforms. Words that drew a line between his world and theirs, a line that could not be crossed. He had known this would happen. He had tried to stay on his side of that line, but this woman had pulled him over it, and now he felt the sting of it as if for the first time. He turned and began walking toward the saloon. Eveline, after a moment's hesitation, followed him. She did not know what else to do. The saloon was quiet in the afternoon heat. A few cattle hands played a listless game of cards in the corner. Silas Grigg sat at a table by himself, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He watched them enter, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He raised his glass in a mock toast to Devereaux as the marshal came in behind them. Kai walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey. Eveline stood beside him, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. This was a public humiliation, and it had been staged perfectly. "Seems the law is a complicated thing, Miss Hart," Griggs said from his table, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "A person cannot just ride into town and lay claim to whatever they please. It takes order. It takes proof." "And it takes honesty," Eveline retorted. turning to face him. "Something that appears to be in as short supply as water around here." Griggs' smile faltered. He was not used to being challenged, especially by a woman. Before he could reply, a quiet voice spoke from the doorway. The truth is often found in the most unlikely of places. It was Padre Luis, the town priest. He was a small, weathered man, his dark cassock dusty from the road. His eyes, however, were bright and missed little. He nodded to Eveline and Kai. "May I have a word with you both?" In the house of God, the acoustics are better for quiet conversation. They followed him out of the tense silence of the saloon and across the street to the small adobe church. Inside, it was cool and smelled of old wood, wax, and the faint, lingering scent of incense. Light filtered through a single stained glass window, painting a bar of colored light on the packed earth floor. "The marshal is a man who loves the letter of the law," the priest said, "because it allows him to ignore its spirit. He builds his fences with paper. To fight him, you must find a gap in that fence." "There is no gap," Eveline said, her voice weary. "He has made himself the gatekeeper." "Perhaps." Padre Luis walked to a small table near the altar and picked up a ledger. "But even the most careful men make mistakes. They become arrogant." He opened the book. "I keep the parish records here. Births, deaths, marriages, and I also handle certain transactions for those who cannot read or write, making sure they are not cheated. Last month, a young man from the Bigay family came to me. His family's small herd of cattle had been confiscated." "On what grounds?" Kai asked, his voice low and dangerous. Marshal Devereaux claimed they had strayed onto Griggs' grazing land. He produced a document, a writ of seizure. The family was given nothing. The young man was heartbroken. It was all they had. "That is theft," Eveline whispered. "It is theft dressed in the clothes of the law," the priest agreed. "But here is the interesting part. A week later, one of Mr. Griggs' foremen, a man named Jebediah Smith, came to me to witness a bill of sale. He was selling 20 head of cattle to a buyer for the railroad. He is not a man who can write, so I drew up the document for him and he made his mark. He was in a hurry and proud of the price he had gotten. He let it slip that these were the same cattle taken from the dine. He was boasting. The priest turned the ledger around for them to see. There, in the priest's neat, careful script, was a record of the transaction. The bill of sale was a clear, legal document. It transferred ownership of 20 head of cattle, with the brands described in detail, from Jebediah Smith to the railway purchasing agent. "The brands," Kai said, his finger tracing the description. "They are the Bigay family's brands." "Exactly," said Padre Luis. "Griggs was too clever to put his own name on the sale of stolen goods. He used his foreman, but in his arrogance, he created a piece of paper that proves the crime. This bill of sale, signed by his own man, is the key." "But what good is it?" Eveline asked, her hope warring with her skepticism. "Devereaux will dismiss it. He will say the cattle were legally confiscated." "He will," the priest admitted, "unless you have a witness, not to the location of a spring, but to the crime itself. The bill of sale is the lock, but you need a citizen, a man of good standing in this town, who is willing to stand up in front of a federal judge or a circuit magistrate and testify that he knew those cattle were stolen from the Bigay family, and that this document proves they were sold for Griggs' profit." They stood in the quiet of the church, the colored light falling upon the open page of the ledger. The path forward was no longer about surveyors' stones and old maps. The fight for the water had become something larger, something that cut to the very heart of the corruption that held Dry Mesa in its grip. The door of the law had been slammed in their faces, but Padre Luis had just shown them a small, hidden window. The only problem was finding a man with the courage to climb through it. The revelation in the quiet church left them with a dangerous new weapon, but a weapon they did not yet know how to wield. A piece of paper was not a shield against men who used fire and force. Eveline knew she could not remain under Josie Pike's roof. Her presence endangered the one woman in town who had shown her kindness. To stay would be to invite Griggs' wrath into Josie's home. "We have to leave town," she said to Kai as they walked back toward the livery. "Not to run, to regroup." Kai nodded, his eyes scanning the street, the rooftops, the alleyways. His senses were heightened, the way they had been in the years he scouted for the army, a time he tried not to remember. He felt the invisible lines of sight, the weight of hostile attention. Dry Mesa was no longer a neutral place. It was enemy territory. They made a plan born of necessity. Eveline would use the last of her money to purchase supplies. Not enough to look like she was establishing a homestead, but enough for a prolonged camping trip. A pickaxe, a shovel, canvas sheeting, rope, and basic provisions. Kai, meanwhile, would ride out to the Begay family and ask if Little Bear, whose leg was healing well, could join them. The boy knew the canyons and washes even better than Kai did, and his presence would provide another set of eyes. More than that, it was a quiet act of alliance. By late afternoon, they were ready. They rode out of town, not east along the main track, but south, as if heading for the Mexican border. Only when the last rooftops of Dry Mesa had sunk below the horizon did Kai turn them eastward, weaving a path through a maze of arroyos that would leave a confusing trail for anyone trying to follow. They made their camp on Eveline's land, not by the hidden spring, which was too enclosed and would make them vulnerable to ambush, but on a wide, defensible mesa that offered a clear view in all directions. It was a harsh, exposed place, with only a few gnarled junipers for cover. They built a small, sturdy lean-to against a rock wall to store their supplies and a makeshift corral of rope and felled branches for the horses. Little Bear, who had been waiting for them at an agreed-upon rendezvous, proved to be a tireless and clever worker, his youthful energy a welcome counterpoint to the grim tension that settled over the adults. For 2 days, they worked. They cleared brush, fortified the camp, and took turns keeping watch. During the day, they would travel on foot to the spring, where Eveline, with a practicality that surprised even herself, began the back-breaking work of digging a proper basin to collect the seeping water. It was an act of faith, a declaration that she was here to stay. In the evenings, they would sit by a small, carefully shielded fire, the silence between them filled with unspoken anxieties. Kai felt the weight of his past pressing in. Each time he scanned the horizon, each time he checked the horses' tethers, he was the scout again. He was leading people into a dangerous place, and the responsibility for their lives settled on his shoulders like a shroud. He had left that life behind, determined to be beholden to no one. Yet here he was, voluntarily placing himself between this stubborn woman and the men who wanted her gone. On the third night, the wind picked up. It was a dry, restless wind that moaned through the canyons and kicked up dust devils that danced like angry spirits in the moonlight. The horses were skittish, tossing their heads and stamping their feet in the corral. "Something is wrong," Little Bear whispered, his eyes wide. "The horses can feel it." Kai was already on his feet, his rifle in his hand. He sniffed the air. Beneath the scent of dust and juniper, there was something else, faint, acrid, and deeply wrong. Smoke. He looked toward the west, back in the direction of the town. At first, he saw nothing but the dark, rolling plains under the moon. Then, he saw it, a thin, orange line, low on the horizon, growing brighter. "Fire," he said, his voice flat and hard, "and the wind is carrying it this way." The next few minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. There was no panic in Kai's voice, only urgent commands. "Little Bear, get the canteens and the food sacks. Eveline, get the horses, now!" The orange line was widening, a hungry mouth eating the dry grasslands, moving with a terrifying speed. The crackle and roar of it was now a low, continuous rumble that grew louder with every passing second. The air grew thick and hot. Eveline ran to the corral, her heart hammering against her ribs. The horses were frantic, their eyes rolling with terror as the scent of smoke and the unnatural light grew stronger. She fumbled with the rope gate, her fingers clumsy with haste. One of the horses reared, its neigh a scream of pure animal fear. "Talk to them!" Kai yelled as he and Little Bear rushed from the lean-to, their arms loaded with supplies. He did not have to say more. She understood. She forced her own fear down, her voice coming out in a low, steady murmur. Easy now. Easy, boys. It is all right. We are getting out. She kept talking, her calm tone a fragile anchor in the storm of instinct driving the animals mad. Just as they led the last horse out, a gust of wind sent a shower of embers raining down around them. The dry roof of the lean-to caught instantly, erupting in a whoosh of flame. Everything they had stored inside, the tools, the extra canvas, the bulk of their food, was consumed in moments. There was no time to mourn the loss. The main fire front was less than 100 yards away, a solid wall of churning flame and black smoke, roaring like a freight train. They ran, leading the terrified horses toward the rocky wash that marked the true boundary of her property, the only place that offered a hope of refuge from the inferno. A gunshot cracked through the roar of the fire, then another. Eveline saw a muzzle flash from a ridge to their left. They were not just trying to burn her out. They were here to make sure the job was finished. "Get down!" Kai shouted, shoving her and Little Bear behind a cluster of boulders. He threw the reins of his horse to Eveline. "Keep them here!" He raised his rifle, and in the hellish orange light of the approaching fire, his face was a grim mask. He was the scout. He was the warrior. The man he had tried to bury was here, and he was all that stood between them and the men on the ridge. He fired once, a deliberate, aimed shot at the muzzle flash. The shooting from the ridge stopped for a moment. He used the pause to herd them deeper into the wash, the stone walls offering some protection. The heat was immense, a physical blow that seared the lungs. The air was a choking mix of smoke and ash. The main fire front hit the edge of the wash, and, for a moment, the world was nothing but a deafening roar and a blinding, suffocating wave of heat and light. Eveline pressed her face against the cool stone, her arms shielding Little Bear, the horses screaming behind them. She was sure they were going to die. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the worst of it passed. The fire, starved of fuel in the sandy wash, swept over them and continued its destructive race across the plains. The world was transformed into a nightmare landscape of glowing embers and black, smoking earth. They stayed huddled in the wash until the first light of dawn broke, gray and bleak, over the devastated land. The air was thick with the smell of burned earth and charred wood, where there had been silver grass and green juniper. There was now only a uniform carpet of black ash. The lean-to was a pile of smoldering timbers. Everything was gone. Eveline walked out of the wash and stood looking at the ruin. The hope she had so carefully nurtured, the small future she had started to build with her own 2 hands, had been turned to ash. The enormity of the loss, of the sheer, hateful malice behind the act, overwhelmed her. Her legs gave way and she sank to the ground, burying her face in her hands as silent, wrenching sobs shook her body. Kai watched her, his face streaked with soot, his eyes hollow. He walked over and stood before her. "I brought this to you," he said, his voice rough with smoke and self-loathing. "If I had not helped you, they would have only used the law. They used fire because of me." Eveline looked up at him. Her face was a mess of tears and grime, but her eyes were clear. She reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "They did not do this because of you, Kai. They did this because of me, because of this land." She pushed herself to her feet, still holding his hand. "They burned this to make us quit." A new light was dawning in her eyes, a light that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the hard, cold light of a fire that had been banked deep inside her. The weeping woman was gone. In her place was someone else, someone forged in the night's destruction. "We are not quitting," she said. "We are going back, and we are going to fight." They rode back into dry mesa, looking like survivors of a war. They were covered in soot, their clothes were torn, and their faces were grim. They did not stop until they reached Josie Pike's boarding house. Josie took one look at them, her face paling. "Get in the back," she ordered, her voice sharp. "Now!" She led them to the kitchen, bolting the door behind them. She gave them water and began tending to a burn on Little Bear's arm. She listened without interruption as Eveline recounted the night's events. When she was done, Josie wiped her hands on her apron, her mouth set in a hard, thin line. "I knew it," she muttered. "I knew it would come to this. Grigg thinks he owns this town, thinks everyone is either bought or scared. He is wrong." She went to a large flour bin in the corner of the kitchen. She reached deep inside and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger wrapped in oilcloth. She placed it on the table with a solid thud. "Grigg may have the marshal in his pocket," she said, "but he has a lot of debt in mine, and in others, he buys on credit. He promises payment. He bullies people into waiting. I have been keeping a record, not just of what he owes me, but of what he owes others. Shady deals for cattle, supplies he never paid for, wages he owes to men who were too scared to ask for them." She opened the book. The pages were filled with Josie's spidery, practical handwriting, a meticulous accounting of Silas Grigg's greed. "He is a house of cards," she said, tapping a page with her finger. "Push in the right place, and the whole thing will come down. This is not a legal document like your priest's bill of sale, but it is a map of his weaknesses. It is ammunition." She took out a few sheets of paper and a pencil. "I will make you a copy of the most important pages. Use it, show it to a federal judge, show it to anyone who will listen. It is time someone lit a fire under him." Eveline looked from the ledger to Kai, then back to Josie. The night had taken everything from her, but the dawn, and the courage of an old woman who was tired of being scared, had just given her a new weapon. The fire had taken her shelter, but it had given her a burning, unquenchable resolve. They did not stay in the kitchen. Josie Pike, with a conspirator's wisdom, knew her boarding house was the first place Devereaux would watch. She led them out the back, through her small, withered garden to a neighbor's yard, and then into the alley. "Go to the old shepherd's hut," she instructed in a low voice, pressing the copied pages from her ledger into Eveline's hand. "It is on the north slope of Sentinel Hill. No one has used it in years, but the roof is stone. It will keep you dry. Stay out of sight until you know your next move." The journey was a tense, silent affair. They moved under the cover of a sky bruised with the promise of a storm, keeping to the low ground, the horses' hooves muffled by the sandy soil. The shepherd's hut was little more than a single room built of stacked, flat stones, nestled so cleverly into the hillside it was nearly invisible from a distance. The door was a single slab of weathered timber hung on leather hinges, and inside it smelled of old stone, dust, and the faint, ghostly scent of lanolin. It was a shelter, nothing more, but at that moment, it felt like a fortress. They unsaddled the horses, rubbing them down before leaving them to graze in the small, protected hollow behind the hut, as the last of the light bled from the sky. The storm that had been threatening all day arrived. It did not come gently. The wind hit first, a physical force that screamed around the corners of the hut. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the stone and the wooden door. A flash of lightning bleached the world white for a half-second, followed by a crack of thunder so immediate and violent it shook the very ground beneath them. Inside, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the recurring, ghostly flashes from the storm. They sat on the floor, their backs against the cold stone wall, the roar of the wind and rain a constant, deafening presence. The fire had stripped them of everything but the clothes they wore and the few items in their saddlebags. The storm seemed intent on scouring away what little was left, in the face of such elemental fury. All pretense fell away. There was only the shared, fragile reality of their survival. "I was married before," Eveline said, her voice barely audible over the storm. Her words were not a response to anything said, but a continuation of a thought that had been running in her mind for hours. His name was Thomas. He was a good man, a kind man. He taught literature at a small college back east. He died of a fever 2 years ago. We never had children. Kai was silent, but it was a listening silence. The lightning flashed again, illuminating her face. He saw not grief, but a profound and weary loneliness. "I came here," she continued, "because I did not want to be a widow in a town full of pitying looks. I wanted something that was mine, something to build. I suppose I was foolish to think it would be that simple." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Every time I think I have found solid ground, it turns to ash or mud." The wind howled, rattling the heavy door in its frame. "I ran away, too," Kai said, his voice a low rumble. "Not from pity, from ghosts. I was a scout for the army. I was good at it. I could read the land, find the enemy, keep the soldiers safe. I thought I was doing something necessary, helping to keep the peace. But the peace never came. There were only broken treaties and broken people. I led men to places where they did not belong, to fights that should never have happened. I saw things, men I respected doing terrible things, men I was supposed to be guiding. One day, I just walked away. I did not want to belong to their world anymore. But I do not really belong to the world I came from, either. So I stay in between." "I am afraid," Evelyn confessed into the darkness. "Not of Grigg or the fire, or even this storm. I am afraid of being alone again, of having nothing and no one, of my entire life adding up to nothing more than a patch of scorched earth." "The fear of attachment," Kai said, "is a different kind of prison. You spend your life making sure no one can hurt you, and you end up building the walls so high you cannot see the sun. When you are responsible for no one is responsible for you. Freedom becomes another word for being alone." The storm raged, a wild symphony of wind and water. He had put into words the truth she had been feeling, the truth he had been living. They were two people running from the same loneliness, just on different trails. In the enclosed, storm-battered space, their separate fears met and merged into a single, shared vulnerability. She felt a shift in the darkness, a slight movement as he leaned closer. He was not reaching for her, but simply closing the small distance between them. A quiet acknowledgement that they were in this small space together. She thought of her husband, Thomas, a man of books and quiet affections. Theirs had been a gentle, comfortable love. What she felt now, in this stone hut with this silent, watchful man, was something else entirely. It was not comfortable. It was raw and fierce and frightening. It was the feeling of being truly seen, not as a widow or a property owner or a problem, but as a woman, stripped down to her most essential self. The fire had burned away her past. The storm was washing away her fear. She whispered, "I do not want to be a virgin tonight," and the Navajo warrior just locked the door. Her words hung in the air, a fragile offering against the tempest. It was not a plea for passion, but a plea for life, a desire to feel something other than loss and fear, to reclaim a part of herself that she thought had died with her husband and been buried under the weight of her fight, to be reborn from the ashes, not as a widow, but as a woman. Kai did not speak. He rose, and in the next flash of lightning, she saw his face. There was no surprise, no judgment. There was only a deep, quiet understanding. He walked to the heavy timber door, which was rattling in its frame from the force of the wind. He slid the thick wooden bolt into its iron housing. The sound of it was a solid, reassuring thud that seemed to push back against the chaos of the storm. The act was not one of possession, but of protection. He was not locking her in. He was locking the world out. He was creating a sanctuary. He was answering her unspoken plea with a silent promise of safety. He came back and knelt before her in the darkness. He did not touch her right away. He simply waited, letting the finality of his action settle between them. When he did reach for her, his touch was not demanding, but gentle, questioning. It was a touch that healed, a slow and patient undoing of all the harm the world had inflicted. In the heart of the storm, within the safety of the stone walls and the locked door. Two solitary people chose to not be alone anymore. The dawn came, quiet and clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed new. The air that came through the cracks in the door was cool and smelled of wet earth and rain-soaked sage. When Evelyn awoke, she was wrapped in Kai's blanket, and he was sitting by the door, watching the light change on the horizon. He was not looking at her, but she felt his awareness of her, a quiet and constant presence. He turned as she stirred. His face was calm. The harsh lines softened in the morning light. The distance that had always been in his eyes was gone. "Good morning," he said. "It is," she agreed, her voice a little husky. She felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling so foreign she had almost forgotten its existence. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was a cheap soldier's journal, its pages warped by weather and use. "There is something I should have told you," he said. "When I was scouting, I kept records, not just of trails and water holes, but of movements. Supply wagons, cattle drives. The army was always moving cattle, buying them, confiscating them, selling them. I learned to recognize the brands, the buyers, the trails they used to move the herds without attracting attention." He opened the journal. The pages were filled with a dense, compact script, interspersed with small, detailed drawings of cattle brands and map sketches. "Grigg is not just a rancher," Kai said. "He is a thief on a grand scale. The cattle he took from the Begay family were not the first. I have a feeling some of the cattle I tracked for the army ended up on his land. He is using the chaos of the territory, the army's constant need for beef, to build his empire. His operation is too big, too smooth. He must have a place where he holds the stolen cattle, a place to change the brands before he sells them, a place no one would think to look." He tapped a page in the journal. "I was on a patrol once, years ago, tracking rustlers for the army. We followed a trail up near Tumbleweed Canyon, a narrow box canyon, easy to defend. We lost the trail, but I remember thinking it would be a perfect place to hide a herd. The army records from that time are probably lost or filed away somewhere to be forgotten. But I have my own record, right here." He looked at her, and, for the first time, she saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, a hunter's glint. Josie's ledger showed Grigg's weaknesses in the town. The priest's bill of sale was a legal key. But this worn-out journal from a life he had tried to leave behind, this was a map. It was a map that could lead them right to the heart of Silas Grigg's criminal enterprise. The shepherd's hut, which had been their sanctuary from the storm, now felt too small, too exposed. The morning after the rain, the world was sharp and clear, every detail etched against the washed blue sky. It was a world that made it easy to be seen. Evelyn, no longer the grieving widow or the frightened newcomer, looked at the collection of papers spread on a flat rock, the copy of Josie's ledger, Padre Luis's bill of sale, and Kai's journal. They were fragments of a crime, puzzle pieces scattered by arrogance. "This is not enough," she said, her voice devoid of its earlier despair. "It is strong, but Devereaux will dismiss it all as circumstance. We are missing the line that connects all the dots. We need to find where Grigg is hiding those cattle." Kai watched her, a new respect in his eyes. The storm had passed through her as well, and the woman who emerged was tempered steel. He saw her mind at work, organizing chaos, building a plan from the ashes of their camp. He was used to giving orders, or walking alone. He found himself, for the first time in a long time, willing to follow. "We need more information from the town," he said, "and we need a better tracker than me." The plan took shape with a quiet efficiency. It was Evelyn who directed it, her voice calm and certain. Kai would slip back into Dry Mesa after dark to meet with Josie and the priest. His task was to gather supplies and any fresh whispers of Grigg's movements. Little Bear Begay, who had appeared at their hut at dawn as if summoned by an unspoken call, was given the most crucial task. "Cattle need salt," Kai had explained to Eveline. Especially if they are being held for a long time in a hidden place, Grigg would have to haul it. A heavy wagon leaves a deep trail, a trail that rain does not always wash away completely. Little Bear listened, his young face serious. He understood the language of the earth, the story told by a broken twig or a displaced stone. He accepted the mission with a solemn nod, a boy tasked with a man's work, and slipped away into the canyons, becoming a part of the landscape. Eveline and Kai spent the day moving, abandoning the hut for a more defensible position, a series of shallow caves carved by wind and water into the side of a tall mesa overlooking the vast network of canyons to the north, including Tumbleweed. It was a place Kai knew from his past, a place that was difficult to approach unseen. As they were making their final trip with the horses, the sky, which had been so clear, turned a bruised, sullen gray with an alarming speed. The temperature dropped. A wind whipped up from the north, carrying the scent of imminent rain. Another one, Eveline said, looking at the clouds. This land is never just one thing for very long, is it? This one is different, Kai said, his eyes on the dark wall of cloud approaching them. This is a gully washer. We need to get to high ground. Now. The rain began. A few fat, sporadic drops that quickly became a deafening deluge. The dry, cracked earth could not absorb the sudden flood, and the water began to run in thick, muddy sheets. The arroyo below them, which had been a dry ribbon of sand moments before, was now a churning, brown river, carrying rocks and debris with it. They scrambled up the slick rocks to their chosen cave just as a flash flood tore through the wash where they had been standing, its roar a testament to the desert's violent power. They stood inside the mouth of the cave, soaked and shivering, and watched the water rage below. You know, Eveline said, her teeth chattering slightly, for a man who claims to enjoy being alone, you have a habit of getting caught in enclosed spaces with me during storms. A small, rare smile touched Kai's lips. The land has a sense of humor, he said. They lit a small, smokeless fire deep in the cave, in its flickering light. Eveline laid out the papers once more, determined to find the connection they had missed. She read names from Josie's ledger aloud, a litany of Grigg's casual debts. Kai listened, cross-checking the names and dates with the entries in his own journal. Wait, she said, her fingers stopping on a line. Jebediah Smith, that is the foreman who signed the bill of sale for Padre Luis. According to Josie, Grigg paid him a large bonus 3 days after the Big A cattle were taken, paid him from a line of credit at the general store. And according to my journal, Kai added, leaning closer to look, an army supply wagon carrying repeating rifles was reported missing on that same day, on the trail north of here. It does not make sense, Eveline murmured. Why would Grigg pay his foreman for a simple cattle sale with money he did not have? Unless it was not for the sale, Kai said, his voice low. Unless it was for something else. For the rifles, payment for a job that required guns. The ambush on the stagecoach, she whispered. They were not common bandits. They were organized. They were armed with good rifles. They were Grigg's men. Kai finished. He was not trying to rob the coach. He was trying to get your map. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of a conspiracy far larger than a simple land grab. They were not just fighting a greedy rancher. They were fighting the man who secretly armed the territory's worst elements, a man who operated his own private, lawless army with the marshal as his captain. The rain softened to a drizzle, and with the fading of the storm came 2 visitors. The first was Little Bear, appearing at the mouth of the cave as silently as a fox. He was wet and tired, but his eyes were bright with success. I found it, he said. The wagon tracks were old, but the rain made them clearer in the low spots. They lead to Tumbleweed Canyon. There is a place, an old abandoned granary, where they store sacks of salt, and beyond that, deeper in the canyon, there is a hidden pasture. I saw cattle, many cattle, and men with rifles. Before they could absorb this, a second figure appeared. Padre Luis, his cassock spattered with mud, a determined look on his face. "Josie told me where you might be," he said, accepting the cup of hot water Kai offered him. "I have been to the town hall. I told the clerk I was updating the parish census and needed to verify some property records for tax purposes. A small lie in the service of a greater truth." He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. "This is not the original, but a copy I made with my own hand. It is the official writ of seizure for the Begay herd." He unfolded it. At the bottom of the page, beneath the dense legal language authorizing the confiscation of the cattle for trespassing, was a signature. It was not Silas Grigg's sprawling, arrogant script. It was the neat, precise, and utterly damning signature of Marshal Devereaux. "He signed it himself," Eveline breathed, her finger tracing the name. It was not just Grigg. Devereaux was not just his hound. He was a full partner in the theft. "This changes everything," the priest said. "This document, combined with the bill of sale, proves the Marshal of Dry Mesa personally confiscated property and then allowed it to be sold illegally for his partner's profit. It is a federal crime." They now had it all. The location of the stolen goods, the paper trail of the crime, and the direct, undeniable link between the two most powerful men in the county. The crack in Grigg's system was no longer just a crack. It was a gaping hole they could now drive a wagon through. They stood together at the mouth of the cave as the last of the clouds parted, revealing a sliver of moon. The priest, the warrior, the boy, and the schoolteacher, a small, unlikely family bound by a shared sense of justice. "They know we survived the fire," Eveline said, her voice steady and clear. "All traces of the victim gone. They will be hunting us now. We cannot wait for a circuit judge to arrive. We have to force their hand. We have to get that proof out, and we have to do it now." She looked at Kai, not for permission, but for confirmation. He gave a single, slow nod. The time for hiding was over. The time for fighting had come. The plan was born of desperation and timed to the relentless advance of the railroad. Padre Luis brought the news, his face grim but his eyes alight with a dangerous hope. A special train was due to pass through, not stopping at Dry Mesa, but slowing for the treacherous wooden trestle that spanned Diablo Canyon 5 miles west of town. On board were federal railroad inspectors, men from Washington, men who operated beyond the reach of Silas Grigg's influence. At the same time, word came from one of Josie's informants, a nervous stable hand, that Grigg was moving a large herd of cattle. He was pushing them hard, aiming to load them at the railhead siding before the inspector's train passed. He was trying to erase the evidence, turning the stolen herd into cash. The trestle was the only way across the canyon. It was the choke point. It was their only chance. Their army was small and unlikely, Kai. Evelyn, Little Bear's father, and 2 grim-faced ranchers who had lost their land to Grigg's paper machinations. They gathered at dusk in the shadow of the mesas, their faces illuminated by a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Eveline sat in the seat of a small, sturdy buckboard wagon. At her feet was a wooden crate containing their arsenal, the ledgers, the maps, the bills of sale, the writ of seizure signed by Devereaux. Every piece of paper was a bullet aimed at the heart of Grigg's empire. The trestle bridge was a skeletal silhouette against the blood-red sunset. It was a terrifying structure, a delicate web of timbers spanning a chasm so deep the bottom was lost in shadow. The wind, a constant resident of the canyon, moaned through the timbers, making the whole structure vibrate with a low, mournful hum. They saw them coming, a dark mass of cattle flowing toward the bridge, urged on by a dozen of Grigg's riders. Silas Grigg himself sat on a powerful horse at the near end, overseeing the operation. Marshal Devereaux was at the far end, his silver star glinting in the last light, ensuring the path was clear. Kai and his small band dismounted, melting into the rocks and scrub on the far side of the canyon, their rifles ready. Their job was not to win a battle, but to create a stall, to hold the cattle on that bridge until the train arrived. "Wait for the train whistle," Kai said, his voice a low command. "Do not fire until you hear it." Evelyn held the reins of the buckboard, her knuckles white. Her job was the most dangerous. She had to cross that bridge in the heart of the chaos and deliver her crate to the inspectors. She looked at Kai, his face set like carved stone in the dying light. He met her gaze for a single, long moment, a universe of unspoken trust passing between them. Then they heard it, a faint, mournful cry echoing through the canyons from the west. "The train!" "Now!" Kai said. The first shot was not aimed to harm. Kai fired into the wooden planks at the feet of the lead steer. The crack of the rifle and the splintering of wood sent the animal into a panicked halt. The ranchers with him fired into the air. The cattle, already nervous on the swaying, unfamiliar bridge, began to low and turn back on themselves, creating a tide of confused, frightened beef. Griggs' riders, caught completely by surprise, cursed and spurred their horses, trying to force the herd forward. From the far side, Devereaux shouted orders that were torn away by the wind. Another volley of shots from Kai's men kicked up dust and chaos. The cattle drive dissolved into a stampeding, bellowing logjam on the narrow trestle. The train whistle shrieked again, closer now, a sound of oncoming judgment. This was her moment. Eveline slapped the reins hard against the horse's back. "Go!" she cried. The horse, spooked by the noise, lunged forward, pulling the buckboard onto the bridge. Splinters flew past her head as one of Griggs' men fired at her. She ducked low, keeping her eyes fixed on the far side of the canyon. The wagon wheels bounced and clattered on the uneven railroad ties. The whole world a terrifying blur of panicked cattle, shouting men, and the dizzying drop into the shadows below. A bullet tore through the side of the wagon, inches from her leg. "Do not let the papers fall," she muttered to herself. The words a desperate, half-mad joke against the thunder of hooves and gunfire. Devereaux saw her. He saw the crate at her feet and understood everything in an instant. All his careful plans, his power, his future were in that small wooden box, rattling its way across the bridge toward the men who could destroy him. Rage and desperation twisted his face into a mask. He turned and ran to a small supply cart near his end of the bridge, pulling out a canvas sack, dynamite. Kai saw him too. He saw the marshal pull out the bundle of waxed paper sticks and the coil of fuse. He was not just trying to stop her. He was going to destroy the bridge, the evidence, the witnesses, everything. Kai broke from his cover, running onto the trestle, his moccasins sure-footed on the treacherous ties. He moved with a predator's grace, weaving through the terrified cattle, his rifle held at his side. The train was rounding the final bend, its single bright eye cutting through the twilight. Its whistle was a continuous, deafening scream. Devereaux fumbled with a match, shielding it against the wind. He got the fuse lit. It sputtered, a small, angry snake of fire eating its way toward the dynamite. He turned to throw it toward the center of the bridge, and Kai hit him. They fell together in a tangled heap, the rifle clattering away. They were two men locked in a primal struggle for survival on a narrow wooden plank 1,000 feet in the air. Devereaux was strong, his muscles corded with a bully's power, but Kai was faster, fueled by a cold, clear rage. He fought not just for Evelyn, but for the Begay family, for the ghosts of 100 broken treaties, for his own stolen peace. He twisted his body, slamming the marshal's hand against a steel rail. Devereaux cried out in pain, his grip loosening on the dynamite. The hissing bundle flew from his hand, tumbling over the side of the bridge. It fell into the deep darkness of the canyon, a tiny, fading firefly. The wagon cleared the last of the trestle just as a deep, subterranean boom echoed up from the canyon, the force of the blast vibrating through the timbers. The train, its brakes screeching in a shower of sparks, ground to a halt 50 yards past the bridge. Armed men, railroad guards, spilled from the cars, their weapons ready. Back on the bridge. Kai slammed Devereaux against the railing. For a moment, the fight went out of the marshal. He stared at Kai, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. Then, with a final, desperate surge of strength, he lunged, trying to throw them both over the side. Kai sidestepped, and Devereaux, propelled by his own momentum, went over. He did not scream. His hands clawed at the empty air, his eyes wide with a final, terrible surprise, and then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows he had helped create. The gunfire had stopped. Grigg, seeing the train, the armed guards, and his marshal vanishing into the abyss, raised his hands in surrender. His riders, leaderless and outgunned, followed his example. Evelyn brought the buckboard to a stop beside the train. A tall, grim-faced man in a city suit approached her, flanked by 2 guards. "What in the name of God is going on here?" he demanded. Evelyn looked at him, her face smudged with soot, her hair wild from the wind, and smiled a weary, triumphant smile. She pointed to the crate at her feet. "Proof," she said. "I believe you gentlemen are the first honest law to come through this territory in a very long time." The aftermath on the trestle was a study in contrasts. The chaos of the gunfight gave way to the quiet, methodical authority of the federal men, their leader. A stern man named Albright with a neat city suit and weary eyes took charge with an air of absolute competence. Silas Grigg, stripped of his power and bluster, seemed to shrink before their eyes, becoming just a fleshy, frightened man as his hands were bound. His riders, seeing their paymaster arrested by a power far greater than the town marshal, offered no resistance. They were simply men without a master now, and they faded back toward town, their loyalty dissolving with the last light of the sun. A search party was organized to scour the bottom of the canyon for Devereaux's body, but the inspectors held little hope of finding anything in the darkness. For official purposes, Marshal Devereaux was declared suspended from duty, pending an investigation into his disappearance. It was a neat, legal fiction that left a thread of unease hanging in the cool night air. The return to Dry Mesa was a strange procession. Kai and Evelyn rode at the head of their small band of ranchers, followed by the wagon carrying their crate of proof, which was now under the protection of 2 armed railroad guards. The town was not sleeping. Lamps burned in every window. People stood in silent clusters on the wooden sidewalks, their faces pale and uncertain in the lantern light. As they passed, the community split down an invisible line. Some people turned their backs, their loyalty to Grigg's system, or their fear of its collapse, running too deep. But others, more than Evelyn had expected, met her eyes with a look of dawning hope. A few men even took off their hats in a gesture of respect. Josie Pike stood on the porch of her boarding house, a shotgun held loosely in her arms, a fierce, proud smile on her face. The next morning, the town hall was a different place. The clerk, a man whose spine had previously been made of jelly, was now a model of deferential efficiency, with Mr. Albright observing from a corner, his presence a silent guarantee of due process. Evelyn submitted her claim. The 2 ranchers who had fought beside them stood as witnesses, their sworn testimony confirming the location of the original boundary stone. Padre Luis provided a statement attesting to his knowledge of the land's history. The papers were signed, stamped, and filed. The land, and the water that was its lifeblood, was officially, legally, and irrevocably hers. Victory did not feel like a sudden, triumphant trumpet blast. It felt like the quiet, solid weight of a stone settling into place. The days that followed were a time of slow healing, both for the land and for the people. The federal authorities remained in town, their quiet investigation unraveling the web of corruption Grigg and Devereaux had spun. Witnesses, once silent with fear, began to come forward. The Begay family's cattle were returned, and other claims of theft and intimidation were finally being heard. For Kai and Evelyn, the work was more tangible. They did not stay in the town. They returned to the blackened patch of earth that was her home. They lived in the cave on the mesa, and every day, From sunrise to sunset. They worked. They cleared away the charred remains of the lean-to and began to build something new, something stronger, a small, sturdy barn, with walls of stone scavenged from the wash and beams of juniper they hauled from the high country. The work was hard, a punishing rhythm of lifting, digging, and hammering. It was a silent conversation between them, a partnership expressed not in words, but in the shared effort of their labor. She learned the heft of an axe, the satisfaction of a well-placed stone. He learned to accept her help, to see her not as someone to be protected, but as an equal. Her stubborn determination, a force as strong as his own physical power. They were building more than a barn. They were building a life, from the ground up. One afternoon, as Eveline was struggling to lift a heavy beam into place, Kai came and stood beside her, taking most of the weight. "I have been thinking," he said, his eyes on the distant horizon. "When this is finished, I should probably leave." Eveline's heart went cold. She did not look at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "It is what I do. I do not stay in one place for long." He was not looking at her either. He was looking at the endless expanse of the territory, the open land that had always represented his freedom. She did not argue. She simply nodded. And they lifted the beam into place together, the silence between them now heavy with what he had said. For the next few days, a distance grew between them. He became quieter, more withdrawn. She saw him watching the horizon, his face a mask of conflict. She understood. He was a man who had defined himself by his lack of ties, by his ability to move on, to stay here, to be part of this structure they were building, was to become something new, a settler, a resident, a man with a home. And that, she realized, was a cage he had never been willing to enter. He feared being trapped, not by walls of stone, but by the expectations of a life he had never wanted. One evening, they were digging at the spring, widening the basin and lining it with flat stones to create a proper well. The work was slow, but the result was a deep, clear pool that reflected the evening sky, a future made of stone and water. "This is good work," Eveline said softly. "What you are doing here, it will last." He did not reply. He stood and looked at the half-finished barn, at the newly lined well, at her. He saw the strength in her face, the quiet resilience that had taken every blow Grigg had thrown and had refused to break. He saw the home they were making, not a cage, but a beginning. He looked at the vast, open land stretching away from them, and for the first time in his life, it did not look like freedom. It looked empty. He realized that freedom was not the absence of connection, but the courage to choose it. He walked over to where she was standing. He did not have a ring. He did not have pretty words. He picked up the heavy hammer they had been using to set the stones. He held it out to her. "I am not a good man for staying put," he said, his voice rough. "I do not know how to be a husband, but if you will have me, I will learn." Eveline looked from the hammer to his face. She saw the fear in his eyes, but she also saw the decision, the profound choice he was making. A choice to stay, a choice to build, a choice for her. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of a joy so deep it was almost painful. She laughed, a sound that was half sob, half pure delight. She took the hammer from his hand, its wooden handle smooth and worn from their shared work. "Is this my engagement ring?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded, a slow, serious movement. "Then I accept," she said, "but you should know. A ring this heavy means you are expected to do a lot of repairs." A true smile, the first she had ever seen from him that reached his eyes, transformed his face. The walls he had built around himself for so long finally came down. A few days later, Padre Luis rode out to see their progress, bringing them supplies and news from the town. He told them that Grigg had been transported to a federal prison to await trial, and that the search for Devereaux's body had been officially called off. "The town is breathing again," the priest said, looking at their handiwork with approval. but it is a nervous sort of peace. Why? Eveline asked. Rumors, he said, lowering his voice. A prospector came through town yesterday. He was camping down near the border. He swears he saw a man who matched Devereaux's description, said his arm was broken and his face was a ruin. But he was alive, and he was buying guns. The priest shrugged. It is likely just a ghost story. A man could not survive that fall, but the story is spreading. It is a shadow, a reminder that some evils are not so easily buried. He rode away, leaving them in the quiet of the evening. The half-built barn stood as a monument to their hope, the new well-promised life. But the priest's words were a cold wind, a whisper from the past that suggested the final cost of their peace had not yet been paid. A year passed. The land, which had briefly flourished after the storm, turned thirsty again. The sky became a vast, empty bowl of polished brass, and the creek bed that bordered the town reverted to a highway of cracked mud and pale stones. The public well in Dry Mesa slowed to a trickle, then to a muddy seep, and the old anxieties began to creep back into the faces of the townsfolk. But this time, the fear was different. It was not the sharp, desperate panic of the year before, because this time there was hope. The hope had a name, the Heart Spring. The small stone barn Kai and Eveline had built was finished, its roof silvered by the sun. The well they had lined with stone was deep and full, a dark, cool eye that never seemed to blink. It was the only reliable water for miles, and it became the new heart of the community. Every morning, a quiet procession of people made their way out to their homestead. Mexican families from the poor side of town, Dine families from the encampment, struggling white ranchers who had once looked at Kai with suspicion. They came with buckets and barrels, and they were never turned away. Eveline devised a system, not of payment, but of contribution. Those who could spare it left a few eggs, a sack of flour, or a promise of a day's labor to help with the next harvest. If the rains ever came, it was a currency of community, a quiet act of rebellion against the creed of scarcity that had ruled for so long. Kai, the man who had sought only to be left alone, found himself the quiet guardian of this new, fragile society. His presence a guarantee that the water would be shared fairly, his calm authority respected by all. He was no longer a man between worlds, but a man who, with this woman, was building a new one. The shadow of the past, however, was long. The story of Marshal Devereaux's survival had become a ghost story told around campfires, a cautionary tale for children. Most people dismissed it as fantasy, but Kai never did. He still scanned the horizon. He still slept lightly. He was a builder and a husband-to-be, but the scout was still there, a watchful presence just beneath the surface. The ghost returned on a moonless night in the driest part of the summer. Kai felt it first, a subtle wrongness in the air that made the hair on his arms stand up. The horses in the corral were restless, snorting and stamping. He rose from their bed without a sound, taking his rifle from its pegs on the wall. "Stay here," he whispered to Eveline, who was already awake. "Bolt the door." He slipped out of the small cabin they had built next to the barn. The night was unnaturally still, the stars brilliant in the blackness. He moved in a wide circle around the homestead, a shadow flowing over the parched ground. He found the tracks near the mouth of the canyon that held the spring. A single boot print, the heel worn in a familiar way. It was the track of a man trying to walk silently, but who was favoring one leg. He was not alone. From the cabin window, Eveline saw a flicker of movement near the well. A man, a gaunt, ragged figure, was standing there, his silhouette stark against the starlight. He held a rifle. It was not Kai. This man was hunched, his posture broken, but there was a terrifying intensity in the way he stared at their home. It was Devereaux. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Her first instinct was to scream for Kai, but she knew that was what Devereaux wanted. He wanted to draw Kai out, to create a clear target. She looked at the heavy bolt on the door. It felt flimsy, inadequate. Her eyes darted around the small room. On the hearth was the heavy iron poker she used to tend the fire. She picked it up, its weight a cold, solid thing in her hand. She did not hide. She went to the single window, standing just to the side of it, in the deep shadow where she could see out but not be seen. She watched him. He was not just waiting. He was doing something at the well, his movements furtive and strange. He seemed to be pouring something into the water. Poison. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had not come just to kill them. He had come to kill their hope, to poison the very heart of the new life they had built. Anger, pure and white-hot, burned away her fear. She had not survived fire and ruin to let this broken man destroy everything. She moved to the door. She did not open it. She took a deep breath and then slammed the heavy poker against the inside of the door with all her strength. The sharp, metallic clang shattered the night silence. "Now!" she yelled, as if to a dozen armed men inside. "He is at the well." Devereaux spun around, startled, his rifle coming up. He fired a wild shot at the cabin, the bullet thudding into the thick timber of the wall. The ruse had worked. It had bought Kai the second he needed. From the shadows of the canyon wall, Kai spoke, his voice calm and deadly. "Drop it, Devereaux." The former marshal whirled, his face a ruin of scar tissue and hatred in the starlight, and fired in the direction of the voice. Kai fired back. His shot was not aimed at the man, but at the rifle in his hands. The crack of Kai's rifle was followed by the splintering of wood and a cry of pain from Devereaux as his weapon was torn from his grasp. He stumbled back, clutching his shattered hand, his face a mask of disbelief. He was a ghost, a creature of rumor, and he had been defeated not by an army, but by a woman's cleverness and a scout's impossible skill. Kai emerged from the darkness, his rifle leveled. Eveline unbolted the door and came out, the poker still in her hand. They stood together, a united front against the revenant from their past. "It is over," Eveline said, her voice steady. Devereaux stared at them, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a mad, impotent rage. He had survived the fall. He had crawled back from the edge of death, fueled by a singular desire for revenge. And it had all ended here, in the dust, disarmed and defeated. They tied him securely and locked him in the barn. At dawn, they rode into Dry Mesa, leading a horse with the bound and broken former marshal slung over the saddle. They delivered him to the new federal agent, a quiet man who listened to their story and looked at the evidence of the attempted poisoning of the well with a grim face. The final ghost had been laid to rest, not by a bullet, but by the clean, impartial hand of the law they had helped to restore. Their wedding was a week later, as the sun was setting, staining the sky in hues of orange and rose. There was no church, no white dress. They stood on the red earth of their own land, the land they had fought for and bled for. Eveline wore a simple blue dress, and Kai wore a clean linen shirt. Padre Luis performed the ceremony, his words simple and heartfelt. Their family was there. Josie Pike, her face a wonderful mess of wrinkles and joyful tears. Little Bear, now a tall young man, stood beside his father, his presence a testament to the alliances they had forged. The ranchers they had fought with stood with their hats in their hands. Kai took her hand. It was calloused and strong, the hand of a woman who knew how to build. She took his, the hand of a warrior who had learned to be a husband. They did not exchange rings of gold, but of promises, spoken quietly in the vast silence of the desert. After the ceremony, as the stars began to appear, a small fire was lit. Someone produced a banjo, and a soft, gentle music filled the air, mingling with the low murmur of conversation and laughter. Children ran and played in the twilight, their figures darting around the stone well that was the center of their world. The gate to the homestead, which Kai had built with his own hands, stood open, a welcome to all who came in peace. Eveline stood with Kai, watching the scene, A light wind stirred, carrying with it the small, feathery seeds of a yucca plant, sending them spinning out into the darkness to find new ground, to begin new life. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest rebellion is to love whom you choose and protect the land that feeds you. Together, he put his arm around her, holding her close. A silent agreement. They were home. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.